March 23, 1983, 8:02 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. A cathode ray tube glows in a darkened room. The signal, snatched from the ether, is grainy but clear. In a signals intelligence station outside Moscow, a technician monitors the live feed of an American presidential address. The audio, translated in real time by a monotone voiceover, fills the silent, tense space. On screen, Ronald Reagan stands at a podium in the White House. He speaks calmly, directly. He outlines the moral and strategic necessity of the Pershing II and cruise missile deployments in Europe. The Soviet monitors have heard this before. They note the rhetoric for the nightly intelligence digest. Then the tone shifts. Reagan leans slightly forward. His words are deliberate, almost conversational. Retaliation to deter a Soviet attack. In the monitoring station there is a pause. The translator's voice hesitates for a fraction of a second. The president continues, painting a vision of a future rendered safe from nuclear blackmail. Well, he gives it a name. The Strategic Defense Initiative. In Moscow, the grainy image fades to static. The room is left in the hum of electronic equipment. The technician removes his headphones. He looks at his superior. The report he must now file will not be routine. It will contain a concept that, on its surface, defies the fundamental grim logic that has governed the superpower standoff for a generation. That logic, known as mutually assured destruction, has just been publicly challenged. A new, uncharted, and terrifying phase of the technological war is beginning, not with a secret test, but with a televised speech. The Soviet state, built on 5-year plans and the uncertainty of dialectical materialism, now faces a proposition from the future, a proposition its scientists must immediately decode, its spies must verify, and its treasury must one day attempt to match. To understand the profound disorientation caused by Reagan's words in Moscow, one must first grasp the Soviet Union's position in the early 80s. It was a posture of hardened, cynical confidence. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, was not an American invention the Soviets reluctantly accepted. It was the strategic reality they had learned to wield as a shield. By achieving rough nuclear parity with the United States, they believed they had secured a permanent, if terrifying, stalemate. The ability to utterly destroy the other side was the ultimate guarantor of sovereignty. This balance was codified in the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile (ABM) Treaty, a document that explicitly forbade the kind of nationwide defences Reagan was now proposing. The treaty was a monument to the shared understanding that defence was destabilising. Security came from mutual vulnerability. This confidence was built on tangible, fearsome achievements. The Soviet strategic arsenal was a brute force masterpiece. The R-36M missile, known to NATO as the SS-18 Satan, was the embodiment of this philosophy. Housed in fortified silos, it could deliver 10 independently targeted warheads, each with the yield of 25 Hiroshima bombs, with enough accuracy to destroy hardened American missile fields. The Soviet military-industrial complex, the VPK, excelled at producing such monolithic systems. They had won the race to space with Sputnik, put the first man in orbit, and built a navy that could challenge NATO on the high seas. In the Politburo's view, they competed from a position of strength. Beneath this granite exterior, however, deep fissures were spreading. The Soviet economy, centralized and sclerotic, was entering a period of secular decline. The era of stagnation under Leonid Brezhnev had seen growth rates plummet. Crucially, the Soviet system was proving fundamentally incapable of mastering the next wave of the technological revolution, the microelectronic and digital age. While the West moved towards silicon chips, personal computers, and software-driven systems, Soviet industry remained wedded to vacuum tubes, analog circuitry, and a culture that prioritized quantity and ruggedness over precision and innovation. Their most advanced computers lagged years behind Western counterparts, were mammoth in size, and were produced in tiny numbers for elite military and scientific use. This technological lag was the system's Achilles heel, and it was most acute in the very areas a strategic defense would demand: high-speed data processing, sensor resolution, software reliability, and materials science. A Soviet scientist could conceptualize a particle beam weapon. Building the power source, the targeting system, and the supercomputers to run it was another matter entirely. Furthermore, the Soviet war in Afghanistan, launched in 1979 to prop up a communist ally, was metastasizing into a grinding, costly insurgency. It was a drain on resources, morale, and international prestige, locking the Red Army into a vicious counter-guerrilla fight for which it was ill-prepared. Across the ocean, a new American administration was conducting a cold-eyed assessment of these very Soviet weaknesses. Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980, entered office surrounded by advisors who viewed the Cold War not as a permanent condition to be managed, but as a conflict to be won. Figures like Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, CIA Director William Casey, and theorist Richard Pipes advocated for a strategy of active confrontation. They saw the Soviet economy as a brittle edifice, artificially inflated by the high oil prices and military spending. The concept of competitive strategies emerged. Identify areas of enduring American advantage, principally technology and economic dynamism, and force the USSR into a competition it could not sustain. The goal was not merely to build better weapons, but to create weapon systems so complex, so expensive, and so dependent on next-generation technology that they would force the Soviets into a spending spiral that would cripple their already fragile economy. The Pershing II missiles in Europe were part of this pressure, threatening to decapitate Soviet command and control with their short flight times. But they were a tactical escalation within the old paradigm. The seed of a more profound disruption was being planted in think tanks and study groups, the idea of moving the arms race from offensive missiles to defensive shields. Defense that could negate the Soviet investment in its mighty ICBM force would not just protect America, it would invalidate the cornerstone of Soviet strategic power. The stage was being set for a shock that was as much psychological as it was military. The Soviet leadership, a gerontocracy led by the ailing Brezhnev, and then his successors Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, operated within a rigid ideological and bureaucratic framework. They understood tanks, missiles, and megatonnage. They understood espionage and diplomacy. They were about to be confronted with a vision that seemed to leap from the pages of science fiction, delivered not in a classified cable but on primetime television. It was a vision that would bypass their strengths and exploit their deepest, most systemic vulnerabilities. The conceptual groundwork for this disruption was being laid in American laboratories and policy circles, where a radical idea was gaining traction, to transform the very nature of nuclear deterrence. The intellectual genesis of what would become the Strategic Defense Initiative was not a single moment of inspiration, but a confluence of scientific speculation, political ideology, and strategic calculation. In the late 70s, a small group of physicists and engineers, often operating on the fringes of the mainstream defense establishment, began to revisit a concept long considered heretical: ballistic missile defense, safeguard, and the Soviet galosh, which used nuclear-tipped interceptors. The consensus was that they were easily overwhelmed, prohibitively expensive, and dangerously destabilizing. But technology had not stood still. Advances in three key areas created a new argument. First, in sensors, the potential for new infrared and optical seekers that could track warheads against the cold backdrop of space. Second, in directed energy, theoretical work on high-energy lasers and particle beams promising the speed of light engagement of targets. Third, in the nascent field of precision kinetic kill, using small maneuverable projectiles to physically collide with a warhead, a hit-to-kill technology that did not require a nuclear blast. These were not mature systems, but they were pathways. To a handful of true believers, most notably physicist Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, and retired Army General Daniel O. Graham, the old obstacles were crumbling. They began a concerted lobbying campaign, arguing that a defensive layer in space was not only possible but morally imperative. This scientific optimism found its perfect political vessel in Ronald Reagan. His view of nuclear strategy was not that of a technocrat. It was visceral and moral. He was deeply affected by briefings on the horrors of a nuclear exchange, the concept of a nuclear winter, and what he saw as the unacceptable moral equivalence of MAD, the idea that the security of the free world rested on the threat to murder hundreds of millions of innocents. He longed for an alternative. When presented with the concepts of space-based defense, he saw not just a weapon, but a redemption. It aligned with his fundamental optimism in American ingenuity and his deep-seated belief that communism was a historical dead end destined to be transcended, not merely contained. The formalization of this into policy was swift following his inauguration. In 1982, he signed National Security Decision Directive 42, ordering a comprehensive study of ballistic missile defense technologies. The study group's findings were cautiously optimistic, highlighting the potential while acknowledging the massive technical hurdles. But for Reagan, the potential was enough. The March 23, 1983 speech was not a detailed rollout of a procurement program. It was a strategic declaration, a statement of intent designed to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. Publicly, it was framed as a hopeful, peace-seeking endeavour, a move away from the grim logic of retaliation. Privately, within the halls of the Pentagon and the intelligence community, it was understood as a masterstroke of competitive strategy. Scientific establishment was deeply skeptical. Many leading physicists, including the staunchly anti-Soviet Carl Sagan, denounced it as a dangerous fantasy, a pie-in-the-sky project that would waste billions, violate treaties and escalate the arms race. But this domestic debate was part of the plan's disruptive power. The very public commitment to pursuing such a future forced the Soviet Union to react. It had to answer a fundamental question. Was the United States capable of such a leap? The Soviet intelligence apparatus, the KGB and the military GRU, were already on high alert. Since 1981, they had been operating under Operation Ryan, Raketno-Yadernoye Napadenie, or nuclear missile attack, a massive global intelligence collection effort ordered by Moscow Center based on a genuine, almost paranoid fear that the Reagan administration was planning a first strike. Ryan tasked every Soviet intelligence officer, from residenturas in major capitals to low-level agents, with gathering signs of Western preparations for war, mobilization orders, blood bank reserves, the movements of political elites. It created a climate of fear and hypervigilance within the Soviet system. Into this atmosphere of acute anxiety, Reagan's SDI speech landed not as a proposal, but as a potential component of a first strike strategy. The Soviet analytical mind, trained in Marxist-Leninist dialectics and military doctrine, struggled to categorize it. Was it a bluff, a propaganda ploy to secure funding for other weapons? Was it a cover for the deployment of space-based offensive systems? Or was it a genuine technological gambit, a sign that the Americans believed they were on the cusp of a breakthrough that would render Soviet missiles obsolete? The lack of a clear answer was, in itself, a weapon. It demanded a response, and in the Soviet system, the only conceivable response was to try to match it. Thus, as Western physicists debated feasibility, and Western politicians debated cost, the Soviet state was presented with a strategic dilemma of existential proportion. They had to assess a system that did not exist. Against a backdrop of their own profound technological and economic weaknesses, all while their leadership was dying off one by one. The race was on, but it was a race run on two utterly different tracks. One of open, chaotic, speculative innovation, the other of secret, desperate, and ruinously expensive catch-up. This state of profound uncertainty and mounting pressure would force the Soviet scientific and military establishment into a reactive posture, dissecting the American program from a dozen different, desperate angles. Inside the sealed, privileged world of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, the initial reaction to Reagan's speech was a mixture of professional contempt and ideological dismissal. In institutes like the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, the Lebedev Physical Institute, and the closed design bureaus of the Ministry of General Machine Building, the first classified analyses were circulated with a tone of skepticism. The physicists and engineers who had built the Soviet nuclear arsenal understood the staggering complexity of the kill chain, detecting a launch, tracking thousands of objects, including warheads and decoys, through the vacuum of space, discriminating the real from the false, and guiding an interceptor to a high-speed impact, all within minutes. To many, the notion of a leak-proof shield was absurd on its face. It violated basic principles of scalability and cost exchange. It was always cheaper to add more offensive warheads or decoys than to build interceptors to stop them. This academic dismissal, however, began to curdle into unease, and then into a specific chilling form of bafflement, as more detailed intelligence and open-source Western research trickled in. The Soviet scientists were not evaluating a single weapon. They were being asked to assess a system of systems, a concept that strained the Soviet scientific and industrial model to its breaking point. Their analysis broke the American program into components, each more daunting than the last. The first component was directed energy. Research into chemical lasers, like the potential miracle system, and the more exotic X-ray laser concept, prompted by Edward Teller's advocacy, sent shockwaves. The X-ray laser, theoretically powered by a nuclear explosion, was a nightmare concept. A single device in space that could potentially lash out at dozens of ICBMs in their boost phase. Soviet physicists could grasp the physics. They had their own laser programs, but the supporting requirements, the power generation, the heat dissipation, the mirror stabilization, the computational firepower to manage the engagements, existed in a realm of precision engineering where the Soviet bloc was notoriously weak. They could conceive of the idea, but the engineering and industrial base to realize it was absent. The second was kinetic kill. The concept of the smart rock or brilliant pebble, a small autonomous satellite that could use its own sensors and propulsion to ram an incoming warhead, was perhaps more terrifying in its implications. It spoke to the American lead in microelectronics, miniaturization, and software. A swarm of thousands of such devices implied a mastery of mass production of sophisticated guidance systems, something the Soviet electronics industry, plagued by low yields and poor quality control, could not hope to replicate at scale. Each pebble required a tiny, powerful computer, a feat of integration the Soviets knew was beyond their capacity. The third and most profound was the battle management system. This was the true heart of SDI, and to the Soviet analysts it was akin to science fiction. To function, a multi-layered shield would require a global network of satellites with infrared and optical sensors, feeding data in real time to supercomputers of unimaginable power. These computers would have to run millions of lines of flawless, bug-free code to make life-or-death engagement decisions in seconds. The Soviet computing paradigm was one of centralized, monolithic machines. The American vision was of a distributed, networked, software-driven architecture. The Soviets understood vacuum tubes and centralized planning. SDI demanded silicon chips and decentralized adaptive software. It was a clash of technological cultures, and the Soviet scientists knew which was ascendant. The cognitive dissonance was profound. They were being asked by the Politburo for a definitive answer. Can they do this? And if they can we? The first question led to agonizing debates. Some argued it was a grand bluff. research programs concluded that the political and technological will was genuine. So was where the bafflement turned to a quiet professional despair. Their reports back to the Military-Industrial Commission grew increasingly grim. They could outline a mirror Soviet program, but the cost estimates were astronomical, and the timeline stretched into the 21st century. They were not just evaluating American technology, they were being forced to perform a brutally honest audit of their own system's capabilities. The verdict was damning. The scientists became the reluctant messengers of a terrifying truth. The Americans were not just building a new weapon. They were attempting to change the rules of the game to a set for which the Soviet Union lacked the fundamental pieces. The race was no longer about who had the bigger rocket, but about who owned the future of information technology. And in that race, the Soviet Union was not just behind, it was on the wrong track entirely. While scientists grappled with equations and material limitations, a parallel shadow war was being waged by the Soviet Union's intelligence arms, tasked with uncovering the reality behind the American dream shield. If the Soviet scientists were baffled by the physics, the KGB and GRU were paralyzed by the paradox. Operation Ryan had already placed the entire Soviet intelligence apparatus on a war footing, searching for indicators of an imminent NATO attack. SDI did not fit neatly into this framework. It was neither a traditional weapon nor a clear mobilization signal. Instead, it presented an intelligence challenge of unprecedented complexity. How to steal the blueprint for a system that existed primarily in view graphs, research proposals, and the imagination of the American defense industry. The directive from Moscow Center was unequivocal and overwhelming. The flood of tasking cables was so intense, it became counterproductive. Diplomats in Geneva were ordered to scrutinize the trash of American delegates for clues. Agents in California's Silicon Valley, more accustomed to stealing chip designs, were told to look for references to beam propagation and kill vehicles. The GRU's military intelligence officers within the Soviet UN mission in New York were tasked with photographing any contractor buildings that might be involved. The problem was one of signal versus noise. S was a torrent. Scientific papers, congressional testimony, defense trade magazines, corporate press releases. Much of it was speculative, optimistic, and contradictory. Was the program real? Or was it a sophisticated disinformation campaign designed to goad the USSR into economic suicide? The KGB's own analysts in Directorate T, Science and Technology, and Directorate Y in Computer Analysis were sifting through this deluge, trying to separate American aspiration from American capability. They faced the classic mirror imaging problem, assuming the adversary's decision-making process and industrial capabilities mirrored their own. The Soviet state would only embark on such a project if it had a high degree of certainty in the outcome. S might commit tens of billions of dollars on what was, in essence, a high-tech gamble. This uncertainty created a toxic environment within the intelligence community. The pressure from the Politburo, particularly from the ailing, paranoid Yuri Andropov, a former KGB chairman himself, was for definitive proof. The intelligence services were expected to provide a simple binary answer. Is it real or a bluff? Their inability to do so was seen as a failure. This led to a dangerous tendency to interpret ambiguous data in the most threatening light. A theoretical paper on laser scattering became evidence of a breakthrough. A Pentagon contract for studies on sensor arrays was seen as proof of imminent deployment. The fear of missing the smoking gun that would prove SDI was operational drove riskier and more aggressive collection efforts. The human intelligence, HUMINT, operations became desperate and, at times, farcical. The KGB attempted to recruit scientists from the Lawrence Livermore and Los Alamos laboratories, but found the targets either ideologically committed or closely guarded by robust Western counterintelligence. They had more success in pressuring allies and neutral countries for tidbits, but the core secrets remained elusive. The technological intelligence, TechSint operations like signals interception and satellite reconnaissance could photograph test facilities like the White Sands missile range, but they could not capture the performance data of a laser or the processing speed of a battle management computer. They saw buildings and test stands, not software code. The greatest intelligence failure, however, was an economic and systemic one. Congress, the defense lobbying system, and the role of competitive corporate bidding tried to explain that SDI's reality was not a single secret to be stolen. It was a diffuse, evolving, and politically driven enterprise. Its very strength lay in its chaotic, pluralistic nature. Thousands of contractors, universities, and labs all competing for funding, generating a cascade of ideas, some brilliant, some dead ends. This was anathema to the Soviet model of a single state-directed design bureau. The GRU, focused on order of battle and hardware counts, was ill-equipped to assess the vibrancy of a civilian technological ecosystem. Ultimately, the intelligence war over SDI was lost before it began. The Soviets were masters at stealing defined, tangible secrets, the plans for a specific bomb, the blueprints for a particular aircraft. They were utterly unprepared to analyze and counter a strategic vision, an open, publicly debated national project that was as much about economic posture and political will as it was about specific technologies. The more they spied, the more they confirmed the staggering scale of American investment and research activity. The absence of a single stealable secret weapon was in fact the most terrifying intelligence of all. It meant the threat was not a device, but a process of innovation their own system could not replicate. The reports flowing back to the Kremlin gradually shifted in tone, from seeking to disprove SDI's feasibility to documenting the alarming breadth of the American effort, an effort that continued to accelerate regardless of Soviet protests. As the spies gathered their troubling reports, the data they compiled fed into a far more concrete and crushing calculation being performed by the state's economic planners. For the planners of Gosplan, the Soviet State Planning Committee, the Strategic Defense Initiative was not a physics problem or an intelligence puzzle. It was a spreadsheet nightmare. Their entire existence was built on the meticulous 5-year allocation of resources in a closed command economy. SDI presented a variable for which there was no column, an open-ended, technologically fluid, and catastrophically expensive strategic challenge from an adversary whose economic output was more than twice their own and whose technological base was pulling away at an accelerating rate. The initial economic assessments, compiled in dry, classified reports, would have made for chilling reading in the Kremlin. The Soviet economy of the early 1980s was already in a precarious state. It was kept artificially afloat by the high global oil prices. Revenue from hydrocarbon exports was the lifeblood that paid for grain imports and subsidized the inefficient industrial sector. The war in Afghanistan was a constant drain, costing billions of rubles annually with no end in sight. Consumer goods were scarce, quality was poor, and agricultural output was perennially disappointing. The system operated on a principle of scarcity management. Into this strained ecosystem, SDI descended like a voracious parasite. The Soviet military-industrial complex, the VPK, was a state within a state, historically privileged with the best resources, materials and personnel. But it too had its limits. It excelled at producing known quantities: tanks, artillery, solid fuel rockets. SDI demanded a wholesale pivot to frontier technologies where the VPK was weakest. The cost-exchange ratios were brutally asymmetrical. The American strategy, whether explicitly stated or not, functioned with perfect predatory logic. Consider the layers of cost. First, the direct R&D. S program, the USSR would need to pour billions of rubles into microelectronics, advanced materials, supercomputing and optics. This meant constructing new, ultra-clean fabrication plants for microchips, a sector where Soviet chips were generations behind, larger, less reliable, and produced in tiny volumes. It meant investing in basic materials science for laser-grade crystals and mirror coatings. Each ruble allocated here was a ruble not spent on modernizing the crumbling civilian infrastructure, on consumer goods to placate a restive population, or on the Afghan war effort. Second, the cost of deployment. Even if research miraculously succeeded, the scale of deployment envisioned was apocalyptic for the Soviet budget. A space-based layer of interceptors or lasers would require hundreds, perhaps thousands of launches on heavy-lift rockets like the Energia, a vehicle so expensive its own development was straining the space program. S Space Shuttle program, for all its problems, showcased a reusable, in theory, launch system. The Soviet Buran shuttle, a desperate and costly copy, was a symbol of this reactive spending. The Soviet system could maybe build one magnificent technological cathedral, like the SS-18 or the Typhoon submarine. It could not build an entire city of them in orbit. Third, and most insidious, was the cost of the offensive response. Soviet military doctrine dictated an asymmetric answer. If the enemy builds a shield, you build a bigger hammer and more of them. This meant investing in penetration aids, sophisticated decoys, radar-absorbing materials for warheads, stealth technology, maneuvering re-entry vehicles, MAVs, and ultimately more missiles and more warheads to saturate the hypothetical defense. This arms race within an arms race was perhaps the most certain financial burden. S could potentially add decoys more cheaply than the USSR could build interceptors, but the Soviet response would still require a massive redesign of its core strategic assets, like the SS-18. The cycle was a financial doom loop. The Politburo, led by men who had come of age during the industrialization drives of the 1930s and the reconstruction of the 1940s, understood production quotas and tonnage of steel. They did not intuitively grasp the economics of software development or the capital intensity of semiconductor fabs, but their advisors from Gosplan and the Finance Ministry could show them the cold numbers. Projections indicated that attempting to match SDI, even at a fraction of the scale, would require a sustained increase in military spending of 15 to 20% annually for the foreseeable future. This was simply impossible without triggering either total economic collapse or a political revolt from a populace deprived of even basic necessities. SDI, therefore, weaponized the very structure of the Soviet economy. It targeted its lack of flexibility, its inability to innovate quickly, and its dependence on finite resource exports. The American economy, with its venture capital, competitive contractors, and deep university ties, could absorb and even thrive on the speculative spending. SDI funding flowed to California, Massachusetts, and Texas, spurring growth in computing and aerospace. In the USSR, the same spending would be extracted like a tax from every other sector, starving them of investment. The Politburo was faced with an impossible choice: cede strategic supremacy to the United States, or bankrupt the state in a futile attempt to keep pace. It was a checkmate delivered not by a missile, but by a budget forecast. Confronted with this existential economic threat, the burden of decision fell onto the aging shoulders of the Soviet political leadership, a group about to undergo a seismic transformation of its own. The Soviet political leadership of the early 1980s was a gerontocracy in literal and figurative decay. Leonid Brezhnev, who had presided over the era of stagnation, and the invasion of Afghanistan, was a fading figure, his speeches slurred and his grip on reality loosening. His immediate successors, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, were men of the old guard, shaped by the Great Patriotic War and the Stalinist system. Andropov, the former KGB chief, viewed SDI through the lens of Operation Ryan, as a potential component of an American first strike plot, a deadly serious escalation to be met with fierce resistance and counter-threats. His directives were rooted in a deep-seated institutional paranoia. Chernenko, a bland party bureaucrat, had no capacity for strategic innovation. It was the language of the old Cold War, a dialect the Americans were no longer speaking. This changed fundamentally with the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev into March 1985. Gorbachev represented a new generation, a shestidesiatniki, or man of the 60s, who had witnessed the failures of the system firsthand but still believed in the potential of a reformed humane socialism. His inner circle, including men like Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze and advisor Alexander Yakovlev, were realists. They had access to the same grim reports as their predecessors. The scientific assessments branding SDI a potential leap they could not match the KGB findings, detailing the vast American effort, the Gosplan forecasts predicting economic ruin. But they drew a different conclusion. Where the old guard saw a threat to be counteracted at all costs, Gorbachev and his reformers saw a trap to be disarmed through diplomacy and a symptom of a deeper disease within the Soviet system. Gorbachev's strategy toward SDI became the central paradox of his foreign policy. Publicly, he waged a furious propaganda campaign against it, labeling it Star Wars to underscore its fantastical nature and rallying global opinion. He understood its emotional power and sought to undermine it. Privately, however, his approach was one of desperate negotiation. He recognized that SDI was not merely a weapon system. It was the ultimate bargaining chip. The one thing the Americans valued so highly they might trade almost anything to protect its development. His goal became not to build a Soviet SDI, but to persuade Reagan to abandon the American one. This placed Gorbachev in a position of profound weakness, which he tried to spin as moral strength. At the Geneva summit in 1985 and more dramatically at Reykjavik in 1986, he linked radical proposals for nuclear arms reductions, even the total elimination of strategic weapons, to strict limits on SDI testing and development. S would confine SDI to laboratory research. It was the ultimate admission that the Soviet nuclear arsenal, the prize of 50 years of sacrifice, was becoming obsolete in the face of American technological ambition. Reagan's response at Reykjavik, a polite but immovable refusal to curtail his vision of strategic defense, was a watershed. For Gorbachev, it was a personal and strategic shock. It proved that SDI was non-negotiable for Reagan, not because it was technically ready, but because it represented an ideological article of faith, the belief that American technology could transcend the grim balance of terror. The American president was betting on a future the Soviet leader could not afford to buy into. This failure at the bargaining table forced the final grim realization upon the Soviet leadership. They could not stop SDI diplomatically. They could not build it themselves economically. The only remaining option was a form of strategic surrender disguised as a policy shift. Gorbachev's new thinking in foreign policy, with its emphasis on reasonable sufficiency in defense and unilateral concessions, was in part a direct reaction to the SDI impasse. If you cannot beat the shield, you stop threatening the wielder. You unilaterally reduce the number of missiles aimed at him in the hope he will see less need for the shield. The decision to sign the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty in 1987, eliminating an entire class of Soviet missiles, was a move that would have been unthinkable before the SDI shock. It was a tacit admission that competing in the high-tech arms race Reagan had ignited was a losing proposition. Thus, for the Soviet leadership, SDI served as the catalyst for a cascading failure of confidence. It exposed the intellectual bankruptcy of the old guard and presented the reformers with an unsolvable equation. Gorbachev's attempt to trade away the Soviet offensive arsenal to kill SDI was the ultimate act of strategic desperation. When it failed, the path was cleared for a series of retreats that would ultimately unravel the Soviet bloc itself. The Politburo had been outmaneuvered not on the battlefield, but on the conceptual battlefield of the future. The diplomatic collision at Reykjavik was not merely a failed summit, it was the moment the abstract pressures of science, intelligence, and economics crystallized into a single, stark moment of geopolitical truth. October 11th to 12th, 1986. Höfti House, Reykjavik, Iceland. The meeting was conceived as a preparatory session for a future summit in Washington. The setting, a stark white wooden hull house by the cold North Atlantic, was meant for brisk, businesslike talks. Instead, over 2 days, it became the scene of the most extraordinary and dizzying nuclear negotiations in history. The dynamic was a stark contrast of personalities and positions. Ronald Reagan, the ideologically driven optimist, armed with the conviction of his strategic vision; Mikhail Gorbachev, the pragmatic reformer, armed with the desperate knowledge of his economic and technological limits. SDI was the sun around which all other planets orbited. Gorbachev came with a bold, preemptive offer, crafted to seize the initiative and test Reagan's commitment to his own rhetoric of a world without nuclear weapons. He proposed in stages the elimination of all Soviet and American intermediate-range missiles in Europe, the zero option Reagan himself had once proposed as propaganda. Then he went further. He proposed a 50% reduction in all strategic nuclear weapons. Then, unbelievably, he suggested the elimination of all strategic ballistic missiles within 10 years. The numbers were staggering. It would mean dismantling the entire Soviet ICBM force, the backbone of its strategic deterrence. The room grew tense, electric. Reagan and his team, particularly Secretary of State George Shultz, were both intrigued and suspicious. The scale of the concession was unprecedented. But there was a catch, a single, non-negotiable condition anchoring every proposal. As Gorbachev laid out each breathtaking reduction, he attached the same string. All of this was contingent on the United States agreeing to confine the Strategic Defense Initiative to laboratory research for a period of 10 years, adhering to a strict interpretation of the ABM Treaty. He framed it not as a kill shot to SDI, but as a necessary period of stability to allow for the peaceful dismantling of offensive arms. In his mind, it was a grand bargain. The Soviets would give up their swords if the Americans would delay building their shield. For Reagan, this was not a compromise, it was a betrayal of a fundamental principle. To him, SDI was the Holy Grail, the technological promise that would make the elimination of nuclear weapons not just desirable, but safe. He saw Gorbachev's condition not as a reasonable quid pro quo, but as an attempt to kill the future of defense in its cradle. "The meeting is over," Reagan reportedly said at one critical juncture. The drama escalated on the second day. The two leaders, almost alone with their interpreters, wrestled with the scope of abolition. The discussion spiraled into a vision of total nuclear disarmament. For a few fleeting hours, the two most powerful men in the world stood at the brink of an agreement to eliminate all nuclear weapons, but each time the conversation slammed against the same immovable object, SDI. Reagan offered to share the technology with the Soviets, a fanciful notion born of his genuine belief in the project's peaceful purpose. Gorbachev dismissed it as a fairy tale. He knew the Americans would never share their crown jewels, and the Soviets could never trust them to do so. He needed a legal, verifiable restriction. The final exchange was the turning point. The outlines of a historic deal were on the table. Massive, deep cuts leading towards zero. The world's nuclear nightmare seemed within reach of being dismantled. All that stood in the way was the testing regime for a system that did not yet exist. Reagan would not yield. Gorbachev could not, for to return to Moscow having legitimized SDI's full development would be to admit defeat in the core technological struggle and invite fury from his own military-industrial complex. He had pushed to the limit of his own authority. The two men stood up. The deal was lost. They walked out into the Icelandic gloom, having come closer to nuclear abolition than any leaders before or since, and having failed because of a dream of perfect defense. For Gorbachev, the failure was absolute and illuminating. Reagan's unwavering commitment to SDI, even at the cost of this historic prize, proved it was not a bargaining chip. It was the centerpiece of American strategy. The Soviet Union could not talk its way out of the challenge. The technological race was real, and it was a race the USSR was now confirmed to be losing, on terms it could not alter. The collapse at Reykjavik did not end the confrontation. It internalized it. The shockwave from that Icelandic house travelled directly to the heart of the Soviet scientific military establishment, triggering the final definitive reckoning. Instead, it triggered a process of grim internal liquidation. The Politburo and the military command now required a definitive bottom-line assessment from the only people who could provide it, the senior scientists and engineers of the Soviet Academy of Sciences and the VPK. The question was stripped of ideology and diplomacy. Ignoring what the Americans say based on our own capabilities, what is possible? The series of reports produced between late 1986 and 1988, most notably a comprehensive analysis led by the Presidium of the Academy, constituted the official scientific surrender. Their conclusions were methodical and devastating. They did not deny the theoretical possibility of ballistic missile defense, first strike, or even defend against a retaliatory strike. The assessment broke down along lines that had become familiar, but now with the finality of a verdict. On directed energy weapons, Soviet research, particularly at facilities like the Altai Laser Center, had produced experimental lasers, but the jump from a laboratory beam to a combat system operating in space was a chasm of engineering. The power requirements were astronomical. The pointing and tracking accuracy needed to hit a missile booster hundreds of kilometers away required a level of precision in optics and stabilization that Soviet industry could not mass-produce. The X-ray laser concept, while frightening, was deemed a one-shot, uncontrollable weapon of desperation, not a reliable shield. On kinetic kill vehicles and space-based interceptors, here the verdict was even more damning. A space-based interceptor swarm required miniaturized, hardened, and incredibly reliable onboard computers, sensors, and thrusters. It required the capacity to launch thousands of these devices into orbit. The report bluntly stated that Soviet microelectronics were 5 to 7 years behind the West, and the gap was widening, not closing. The production yield for advanced chips was so low that equipping a meaningful number of interceptors was logistically and economically inconceivable. But the coup de grace was the analysis of the Command, Control and Battle Management System, C2BM. This was recognized as the true core of SDI, and the absolute pinnacle of Soviet weakness. The report described a system that would need to process data from thousands of sensors in real time, discriminate between warheads and decoys using complex algorithms, assign targets to thousands of interceptors, and assess damage, all within a 30-minute window. This required not just supercomputers, but networks of them, running millions of lines of flawless software. The Soviet computing industry was oriented towards centralized number-crunching machines for specific tasks like weapons design or code breaking. It had no culture of distributed networking, no expertise in the vast complex software engineering required, and no infrastructure to develop it. The scientists concluded that even with unlimited funding, creating such a system was a 25-year project, a timescale that rendered it irrelevant to the current crisis. The final humiliating conclusion was economic and systemic. 5 to 2 trillion rubles over 20 years. This would necessitate doubling the already crushing military budget, requiring cuts to civilian investment and consumption so deep they would trigger social unrest and guarantee the collapse of Gorbachev's economic reform program, Perestroika. The message was clear. Pursuing SDI would destroy the Soviet economy faster than any American first strike. This scientific verdict was the true turning point. It moved the SDI challenge from the realm of external threat to internal diagnosis. The disease was not the American program, it was the Soviet system's inability to respond to it. The Politburo, now dominated by Gorbachev's reformers, received these reports as a scientific mandate for strategic retreat. The policy implications were immediate and radical. The ambitious Soviet space-based weapons programs like the SCIF experimental combat laser platform and the Kaskad anti-satellite interceptor system were quietly scaled back and then effectively shelved. Resources were diverted not to matching SDI, but to cheaper asymmetric responses, developing more ICBMs with penetration aids, like the modified SS-18, and accelerating the development of maneuverable warheads and cruise missiles. But even this was a holding action. The most profound shift was psychological and political. The failure at Reykjavik, followed by the damning scientific reports, stripped the Soviet leadership of its last illusions about competing with the West on technological terms. It convinced Gorbachev and his circle that the arms race itself was the enemy, and that the only way to save the Soviet project was to unilaterally end it. The decisions that followed, the INF Treaty, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the announced unilateral troop cuts in Europe, were all born from this core realization. They could not win. SDI had demonstrated that the next phase of the contest would be fought with tools the USSR could not fabricate. The only rational move was to change the game entirely. The climax was not a battle, but a surrender to facts, a surrender that would unravel the entire strategic foundation of the Soviet state. The strategic retreat mandated by this internal collapse would have immediate and visible consequences, reshaping the military landscape of the late Cold War and setting the stage for the final act. The scientific verdict against matching SDI did not lead to Soviet disarmament. Instead, it triggered a frantic budget-conscious scramble for asymmetric counters, cheaper ways to blunt the edge of the American shield before it could be fully forged. This period, from 1987 to 91, saw the final, strained efforts of the Soviet military-industrial complex to adapt, efforts that highlighted its limitations even as it tried to innovate. The primary focus shifted to ensuring the penetration of any future defense layer. The existing workhorse, the SS-18 Satan, underwent modifications. New post-boost vehicles were designed to carry a greater number of lighter decoys and chaff clouds, sophisticated enough to mimic the radar and infrared signatures of real warheads during mid-course flight. The goal was to saturate the tracking and discrimination systems of the proposed American shield with false targets, overwhelming its interceptor inventory. Simultaneously, research accelerated on maneuvering re-entry vehicles, MAVs. These were warheads that could adjust their trajectory in the terminal phase of flight, dodging incoming kinetic kill vehicles. This required advances in heat-resistant materials and tiny guidance systems, again pressing against the limits of Soviet miniaturization. A second, major strategic pivot was toward cruise missiles. Unlike ballistic missiles, which follow a predictable arc through space, low-flying cruise missiles are inherently harder for space-based sensors to track. The Soviet investment in long-range, nuclear-armed cruise missiles, like the new Kh-55, AS-15 Kent, and its successors, received renewed emphasis. S from unpredictable low-altitude corridors, complicating any defensive architecture. This air-breathing threat represented a different kind of problem for SDI, one that required a separate dense network of air defense sensors and interceptors. Perhaps the most telling direct consequence was the fate of the Soviet Union's own Star Wars projects. The two most prominent were the Polyus Skiff orbital combat laser platform and the Cascade anti-satellite missile system. Polyus Skiff, a gargantuan spacecraft designed to test laser components in orbit, became a symbol of the doomed effort. Its development was rushed, plagued by technical problems born of the very systemic weaknesses SDI had exposed. When it was finally launched in 1987 on the first Energia rocket, a software error caused it to fire its maneuvering thrusters incorrectly, sending it tumbling back into the atmosphere instead of reaching orbit. It burned up over the Pacific. The failure was not just technical, it was emblematic. The Cascade project, intended to place interceptor missiles in space to kill enemy satellites, and potentially warheads, was quietly deprioritized, its funding siphoned away. On the diplomatic front, the failure at Reykjavik led directly to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty of 1987. For Gorbachev, having failed to trade away SDI, the treaty became the next best option, a dramatic unilateral-looking concession that would reduce tensions, curry favour with the Western publics, and, not incidentally, eliminate a whole class of NATO missiles that threatened the USSR with short warning times. Signing the INF Treaty was a public admission that competing in the new, high-tech arena was futile. Better to salvage prestige and stability by cleaning up the old conventional arena. It was a retreat, rationalised as peacemaking. Behind the scenes, the economic hemorrhage continued. Even the cheaper asymmetric responses were enormously costly, consuming resources that perestroika desperately needed for civilian modernization. Every ruble spent on MAV research or advanced decoys was a ruble not spent on computerizing the Gosplan accounting system or importing consumer goods to placate a restless population. The Soviet economy was now fighting a two-front war, the tangible drain of Afghanistan and the intangible, but far more existential drain of the technological arms race with the United States. SDI had successfully forced the USSR to spend its scarce capital on countering a phantom, locking it into a cycle of reactive investment that stifled any hope of genuine growth or reform. The direct legacy of SDI and the Soviet Union, therefore, was a military caught in a paradox. It was ordered to prepare for a future war defined by technologies it could not master, using an industrial base that was falling further behind. The officer corps, seeing the INF Treaty and hearing whispers of the damning scientific reports, felt a growing sense of betrayal and obsolescence. The mighty Red Army, which had crushed the Wehrmacht and cowed Europe for decades, was being told its most potent weapons were potentially nullified by a system of lasers and computers. The psychological impact was as corrosive as the economic one. While the military adapted with last-generation tools, the political and ideological foundations of the state, already weakened, began to give way entirely under the weight of the strategic dilemma SDI represented. The most profound damage inflicted by the Strategic Defense Initiative was not to the Soviet arsenal, but to the Soviet psyche. For 7 decades, the Marxist-Leninist ideology had promised historical inevitability, the triumph of the socialist system due to its superior scientific and economic organization. The space race with Sputnik and Gagarin had seemingly affirmed this. The achievement of nuclear parity in the 1970s cemented the belief that the USSR was not just a military superpower, but a permanent co-equal architect of the global order. SDI shattered this foundational myth. The internal reports from scientists and economists did more than outline technical failure. They delivered a verdict on the system itself. The message, absorbed by the reformist wing of the Politburo and the intelligentsia, was clear. Socialism could not win the next stage of human development. It could not generate the spontaneous innovation, the flexible integration of civilian and military technology, or the capital allocation efficiency required to compete in the information age. The United States could contemplate a project of SDI's scale precisely because its economy was dynamic, its universities were free, and its private sector thrived on risk. The Soviet Union was buckling under the attempt to analyze it. This catalyzed a crisis of confidence within the ruling nomenklatura. For generations, the compact had been simple. The party managed a closed, complex system, and in return, it delivered security, status, and a narrative of victory. By the late 1980s, it was delivering neither guns nor butter effectively. The war in Afghanistan was a quagmire, the stores were empty. The faith that the system could protect them or even sustain itself began to evaporate. When the leadership itself, in the form of Gorbachev, began speaking of new thinking and common human values, it was seen by hardliners as an admission of ideological surrender, prompted by strategic weakness exemplified by the SDI challenge. This blowback directly fueled the forces of dissolution within the Soviet Empire. In Eastern Europe, dissidents and reform communists watched Gorbachev's desperate diplomacy and his inability to counter SDI. They sensed the overstretch, the loss of will. The Soviet Union could no longer afford to subsidize their economies, nor credibly threaten military intervention to maintain ideological purity, as it had in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. The Brezhnev Doctrine was dead, killed by economic and technological overextension. The peaceful revolutions of 1989 were, in part, enabled by this realization that the Soviet center was too preoccupied with its own existential crisis to hold the periphery. Furthermore, SDI accelerated the process of intellectual disarmament. The need to engage with the West to somehow constrain the program drove Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, openness. To argue effectively against SDI in international forums, Soviet officials had to adopt Western frames of reference, discussing verification protocols, technical definitions, and strategic stability in terms the West understood. This required allowing Soviet scientists and diplomats unprecedented access to Western counterparts and information. The genie of openness, once released, could not be rebottled. It exposed the Soviet populace to the staggering gap in quality of life and technological achievement between East and West, further eroding the legitimacy of the system the party was trying to save. By 1919 to 1991, the strategic blowback was complete. The Soviet Union was negotiating the conventional armed forces in Europe, CFE Treaty, making deep unilateral cuts, and the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START, was being finalized on terms highly favorable to the United States. Strategic Modernization Program, including stealth bombers and accurate Trident missiles, continued unabated. SDI, though scaled back and reconceived as the more limited Global Protection Against Limited Strikes GPLS under President Bush, remained a funded research program. The Soviet Union had not stopped it. It had simply exhausted itself reacting to it. In August 1991, when hardline communists launched a coup to halt the dissolution of the Union, they did so in a state of paralyzing confusion. Their manifesto spoke of saving the motherland and restoring order, but they offered no vision for addressing the core crises, economic, technological, nationalist, that were tearing the state apart. They were the last gasp of a system whose strategic confidence had been drained away. The coup's failure and the subsequent formal dissolution of the USSR in December 1991 were the final political aftershocks of a strategic earthquake whose epicenter was, in many ways, Reagan's March 1983 speech. In the archives of the former Soviet Union, researchers would later find the poignant evidence of this ideological blowback. Memos from think tanks arguing that the only way to access the technology needed to compete was through integration with the West, and thus political transformation was a strategic necessity. SDI had succeeded in convincing a critical segment of the Soviet elite that the future belonged to their adversaries, and that survival meant not defeating them but joining them. The collapse of the Soviet Union marked the end of the immediate strategic contest, but the legacy of the SDI gambit extended far beyond 1991, reshaping the very nature of military power, arms control, and great power competition. The Strategic Defense Initiative never deployed a single operational laser or space-based interceptor. Judged by its stated technological goals, it was a failure. Yet assessed as a strategic operation within the Cold War, it stands as one of the most successful feints in history. It was a weaponized idea. Its power lay not in circuitry or rocketry, but in its masterful exploitation of asymmetry. It targeted the Soviet Union's profound systemic weaknesses, its rigid, innovation-stifling economy, its lagging electronics sector, its paranoid, reactive political culture, with a vision of American strengths, technological optimism, economic depth, and strategic agility. SDI was less a shield against missiles than a mirror held up to the Kremlin, forcing its leadership to confront the creeping obsolescence of their entire system. The bafflement of the Soviet scientists was not merely at the scale of the American program, but at the horrifying realization that their own system lacked the organic capacity to even entertain such a dream. The legacy of SDI is etched not in orbit, but in the contours of the modern world. It delivered the final, decisive blow to the concept of strategic parity that had defined the Cold War. It demonstrated that henceforth, supremacy would be determined not by the count of warheads, but by dominance in the foundational technologies of the information age: computing, sensors, networking, and software. This lesson was absorbed globally. The subsequent American military dominance, from the First Gulf War's precision strikes to the networking of the modern battlefield, is the lineal descendant of the technological imperative that SDI championed. Furthermore, it transformed arms control. By making defense a central, non-negotiable bargaining chip, it shattered the old framework based solely on limiting offensive arms. It introduced a permanent element of technological uncertainty, making treaties harder to conclude and verify. The American withdrawal from the ABM Treaty in 2002 to pursue national missile defense was the final, logical step in a path Reagan had charted 2 decades earlier. For the Russian Federation that emerged from the USSR's ruins, the trauma of SDI is a lasting spectre. It bred a deep-seated suspicion of American missile defense programs, which are still viewed not as limited shields against rogue states as Washington claims, but as the potential vanguard of a renewed effort to undermine Russia's strategic deterrent. This paranoia fuels Moscow's investment in exotic new delivery systems like hypersonic glide vehicles, the ultimate asymmetric response, designed to fly under and around any shield, a direct conceptual descendant of the penetration aids conceived in the 80s. In the end, the story of SDI and the Soviet collapse is a testament to the power of psychological and economic warfare waged at the level of high strategy. It proved that a superpower could be defeated not just on battlefields, but in laboratories, and balance sheets. The Soviet scientists in their closed institutes, poring over reports of X-ray lasers and brilliant pebbles, were witnesses to a pivotal transition. They saw the axis of power shifting from the industrial might that built tanks to the cognitive and creative capacity that could imagine and pursue a shield in the stars. Their bafflement was the sound of an era ending. The silence that followed was the dawn of our own, more complex and technologically defined age of conflict.